Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all and welcome to the second lecture in our Millie Bloom Disability Studies series. I will just say a word in Hebrew about the transcription, as ההרצאה היום מלווה בתמלול מאנגלית לעברית, ויש לנו הוראות איך להפעיל את התמלול בצ'אט, אתם יכולים לראות את זה, צריך ללחוץ על כפתור ה-CC, וככה אפשר לראות את התמלול. And I will go back to English now. So thank you everyone for coming. And we at my name is Anat Greenstein. I work at the Center for Disability Studies alongside Professor Shirley Werner, Dr. Ronnie Holler, Dr. Nili Breuer, and Ozzy Sarov that helps us with really brilliant technical support and admin. And Oz, thank you so much for your support. And at the Center for Disability Studies, which we run in partnership between the School of Social Work at the Hebrew University and Joint Israel. And really, it's a great opportunity to say thank you again to our great partners at the Joint, and specifically to Michal Shmuel and Efrat Stern. And our aim at the center is to promote knowledge, research, teaching, and services that are informed by the social model of disability in its broadest sense. And specifically, we also aim to build international collaboration as well as develop local knowledge. And this international lecture series is named after Millie Bloom Zal. And we would really like to thank again Mr. Jim Bloom for his generous donation that enables us not only to bring the international lectures to the local audience and build these international collaborations, but also his donation enables us to support research locally through grants and studentships to local researchers. And also, if you want to find out more about those grants, you can follow us on Facebook, join our mailing list. Oz will have all the details on how to do that in the chat box, probably several times during the lecture, so you won't miss it. So do follow us and get all the information. About this lecture series, so I think you probably all know that, but I will say that again, the Ministry of Welfare in Israel has initiated legislating a Unified Disability Services Act, which is currently in the process of being prepared. And we therefore took the opportunity to dedicate the international lecture series to questions of choice, control, and risk in disability legislation. So this is our second lecture today. In October, we heard from Professor Beresford about the UK experience of implementing user-led disability services and the lessons we might learn from the challenges that they faced there. And you can watch this recording on our website or on our YouTube channel. And you can also read a brief summary of the session on our website. Later this month, we will hear from Dr. Anna Arstein-Kerslake from Australia as well, who will be speaking about legal capacity and new alternatives to guardianship. And in December, we will host a panel that will discuss, finally in Hebrew, where do we go from here in addressing issues of choice, autonomy, and risk in welfare services for disabled people in Israel. And again, more information, etc., sign up for the mailing list. Today, we will hear from Professor G'ma Kaary about the promises and pitfalls of individual funding and what we can learn from the Australian experience of implementing one of the most complex and comprehensive national reforms in disability services, as well as a reform that's quite recent. So it's a recent experience that really will be fascinating. And that will be followed by a comment from Liron David, who will be speaking in Hebrew. about regulating welfare markets in Israel and procurement within this regulation field. We will then have some time for questions and answers from the audience. I do want to say in advance that due to the short time frame that we have, please write your comments in the chat box. You can write them in Hebrew or in English, that's fine. But we will not actually ask people to speak, but I will be reading out your questions in English, and I will read out several questions at a time, and we'll be giving priority to people who haven't participated before. So I hope we'll get to all of the questions, but if we don't get to your question, please understand. So Professor G'ma Kari, thank you so much for being with us today and being so flexible with timings and the clocks changing and how problematic that is for actually scheduling international conferences. We had several back and forth with the times and the clocks. And so really thank you for being here today. So Professor Kari is the academic director at the Center for Social Impact at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and the National Research Director for the CSI network. She works with governments and non-government organizations to identify and change structures and processes that impact inequality. She has worked extensively on joined-up government reforms and social services markets. She believes that working to create equitable living conditions and opportunities is a fundamental responsibility of communities and governments. These beliefs underpin her work at the Center for Social Impact at the University of New South Wales, where she leads a multidisciplinary team of researchers and educators committed to addressing inequality. At the moment, G'ma's research is primarily focused on the implementation of the Australian National Disability Insurance Scheme. This is this comprehensive reform of services and market stewardship. And G'ma has published 4 books and over 90 peer-reviewed articles on different aspects of policy and health. I have to tell you that when I read this bio, I was so jealous. So without further ado, G'ma, thank you very much for agreeing to be with us today, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try and share my PowerPoint. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. And is it showing in the right view, or do you
it's not full screen view, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, let me just quickly see if I can change that. If not, we'll just plow ahead as is. Is that? No, it's not going to let me. Okay. We'll just have to go with how it is. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to get the opportunity to talk about this topic. And, you know, one of the few gifts of a pandemic, right, is getting to talk and across the world in ways we don't normally get to. I'm coming to you from Canberra in Australia, which is our capital here. In Australia, we always begin formal proceedings by acknowledging the custodianship of First Nations people. So I am coming to you from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. You've already heard about me, I think enough. I will just add to that I've actually been researching the NDIS, the Australian National Disability Insurance Scheme, for going on 7 years. I fear it might take up the rest of my career at the rate we're going. But anyway, that's just to say that I've been following it basically for its entire existence. Now, I did promise everyone that I would talk about the NDIS, and I will, but I wanted to start by casting just a little bit of a broader net and talking about the broader category of policies that the NJS came from. And if you've already had a lecture from someone in the UK, that's probably a great follow-on because Australia has a habit of stealing a lot of its policy ideas from the UK. So the NDIS belongs to a particular type of welfare state policy known as personalisation policies. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as individual funding or individual budgets. There's just different terminology depending on where you are. They do mean slightly different things, but they get used interchangeably. And what those policies are about is a shift in how we think about delivering social care services. So if you're not familiar with this terminology, essentially, rather than government providing services directly to citizens, or in the past in Australia, for example, and the UK, we had government contracting other organisations to deliver services. This is another wave where actually we give money directly to citizens and then they purchase services from a quasi market. So an artificially created and controlled market by government where providers compete for customers and those customers are actually individuals who need access to social care. We've seen personalisation grow in the past decade. It was approach sort of that first emerged in the UK. It's now in Norway, it's in Germany, it's in other European countries, and around 7 years ago, it came to Australia. It is most often seen in disability and aged care. Here in Australia, it's predominantly in disability, but we're continually told that it's on the horizon for aged care as well. The goal of personalisation or individual budgets is to give people with disability more choice and control over the services that they access and that they need. At its best, that goal is to see services that are actually personalised. So services that are tailored to individuals' lives and their needs, and they get to pick them. But personalisation sort of sits on a spectrum. So that might be at one end, and then down at the other end, you might just have what we would call shallow personalisation, where there are some attempts made to make things a little bit more user-friendly for a broader set of citizens, but it's not kind of going into that fully tailored, how do I create a set of services that kind of meet my exact needs from the market that I purchase them from. Every country administers personalisation schemes in different ways. Arguably, I would say Australia has created probably one of the most complex schemes. We sort of took personalisation, we added some elements of insurance, and then we rolled it out across a geographical area that is, I have some notes on it, it is over 300 times the size of Israel. So, you know, we were ambitious, to say the least. Some of the complexity in the Australian system that I'll talk through, you know, it was designed as a complex scheme, but I think the parts that are in fact perhaps a little bit more interesting are the bits that came in during implementation that were never there in design, and why they came in to make us land where we are now with a highly complex scheme. Okay, so what is the NJS? I'm just going to swap slides. Now, I tend to only put up one slide when I talk about the NJS, and I do that because it helps you see just how many structures, each of these kind of representing different government agencies or, you know, moving parts of the system around the NJS, just how many there are, and then a little bit about how they sit in relation to one another. And I will sort of make reference to this diagram as we go through. So the NJS was introduced to replace a government delivered system that was described by the government itself as being fractured, inequitable, and it wasn't meeting the needs of people with a disability. The NJS is not a universal service. So in Australia, we have around 4 million people who identify as having a disability, but the NJS is only has at the moment around 500,000 participants. And that's really the upper limit of what the government is going to allow on the scheme, and what was ever modelled as being sort of financially viable for this scheme. It costs $22 billion Australian a year. Sorry, I didn't do the translation of that for you. It costs a lot. It is the second largest kind of welfare policy in Australia. So in terms of cost, it comes in second only to our universal healthcare system. So when you're thinking about the fact that the universal healthcare system is for our entire population of around 20 million people, this comes in second, and it's only for 500,000 people. So it is a large scheme, it is an expensive scheme, and it provides services to people with lifelong and permanent disabilities. And it does this through individual budgets. So it supports people to access services that are, and this is terminology that actually comes from the legislation, deemed as reasonable and necessary for meeting the self-determined goals of individuals with disability. I think that language as a piece of legislation, certainly in the Australian context, it's quite unusual to have something that's quite so broad. I think it's also very ambitious and visionary language to use in a legislative act compared to anything that came before it, and also compared to what we see in a lot of countries in terms of how services for people with disability are regulated. I am giving this talk from my home, and I have very large dogs, and they're likely to walk behind me and interrupt me. So they're not bears, if you're wondering. So the NJS is really a world first in many ways, and I do like to preface things by saying that it has been transformative of the lives of a lot of people on the scheme with disability. It's also really changed the way that disability is talked about in Australia. So it's changing our ideas about what it means to live with a disability. It's really challenged stigma because it came about with a lot of national campaigns about how disability was something that could happen to anybody at any point in their life. And that's sort of those insurance elements were helped sell it. And the NJS was passed back in 2013. So for a reform this big, it is relatively recent. It's sometimes talked about as being fully implemented now. It's sometimes talked about as not being fully implemented. I think government's a little unsure. We are heading towards full implementation. And it was passed with both left and right-wing political parties agreeing to the legislation, which is also very, very rare in Australia. So technically, as of 2020, we were at full implementation at 500,000 people. And achieving that was an enormous coordination effort between our federal government and our state governments. So creating this scheme, and what you see in that diagram in front of you, involved creating a major new co-owned body, co-owned between 8 states and our federal government, which is called the National Disability Insurance Agency. That is a greenish box in the middle of the diagram. I don't think I can use a pointer. No, I can't. We created 13,000 new government jobs to administer the scheme. A brand new regulatory body with several hundred employees in that as well. That is called the Quality and Safeguarding Commission. It's the red box on the top left-hand side. We had to dismantle 8 separate state-run disability schemes that were there before the NDIS, because this is now a federal government responsibility. That required 3 different rounds of what was called bilateral agreements, which were basically 3 rounds of negotiations with 8 states between them and the federal government. So you can only imagine what's involved in that kind of intergovernmental negotiation. We then had to reorientate our entire disability service sector to work within this market context. And because, as I said earlier, personalisation schemes like the NJS work through disability service markets, we then had to also change the culture of people with a disability and those who supported them, whether they were informal, formal carers or family members, to this new way of thinking that they were now in a place to demand things from service providers rather than be kind of grateful recipients of whatever was offered. So the slide I have up shows the full infrastructure of the NGIS. It doesn't show what was taken away to create the NGIS. And that had to be created and it had to happen quite quickly. It was rolled out with very ambitious targets. So the undertaking has been quite enormous. This is the part in my talk where I often say, I've told you the good parts, and now I'm going to tell you the bad parts. And when you embark on a reform this big, things are going to go wrong. So I like to preface it with that. There's going to be all manner of unexpected challenges that emerge. And something I'll talk a bit later, you get things like politics that can disrupt the design of the policy and then change its effectiveness and the way that it works. And we've seen all of that in the 7 years or 8 years since it was launched.
Sorry,
the
Gemma?
important... Yes?
Sorry, I will just stop you for a minute because you were saying super important stuff, and I would like to just briefly summarize and translate that into Hebrew because I think some of that was lost. So I will say in Hebrew not every word. מה שג'מה סיפרה לנו עד עכשיו זה על המבנה של הרפורמה ועל כמה היא מורכבת. רפורמה שבעצם איחדה את כל השירותים של אנשים עם מוגבלות באוסטרליה, שמונים כ4 מיליון אנשים, סך כל האנשים עם מוגבלות כרונית, lifelong, כן, לכל החיים, אבל כרגע משתמשים במערכת הזאת רק כ450 עד 600 אלף מהאנשים עם מוגבלות באוסטרליה, וזה בערך התקציב שהמערכת מגיעה אליו. כרגע היא גם לא כוללת טיפול באנשים שהמוגבלות שלהם היא קשורה לגיל ולזקנה, אבל יחד, למרות שהיא משרתת רק 450 עד 600 אלף איש, המערכת הזאת היא מאוד מאוד יקרה, והיא השנייה בעלות שלה רק למערכת הבריאות הלאומית שלהם. היא מערכת שהיא מערכת לאומית, אז כדי להקים אותה פירקו 6 מערכות שונות שהיו ברמה של הסטייט, אוסטרליה מחולקת למדינות שונות, אז הם הקימו אותה ברמה של כל הסטייט, וחלק ממה שהם היו צריכים לייצר בתוך המערכת הזאת, מעבר לחקיקה ולפירוק והמשא ומתן עם הרשויות השונות, הם היו צריכים לייצר גם safeguarding, זאת אומרת בטיחות, פיקוח, שמירה, איך לדאוג שאנשים לא מנוצלים בתוך המערכת הזאת, וגם לדאוג לחנך בעצם או לתמוך במשתמשים של המערכת ובמשפחות שלהם שעוזרות בטיפול, כדי שיהיו במקום הזה שהם יודעים שהיום הם יכולים לדרוש משירותים דברים, ולא רק לקבל דברים מתוך השירותים. זה ככה סיכום כללי, אני לא יודעת, רוני, אני פספסתי איזה משפט חשוב.
אני חושב שסיכמת את זה בצורה טובה, ואחר כך נעצור עוד פעם, אולי לסכם עוד טיפה, אם נראה שצריך.
כן. Okay, so thank you, G'ma. I might stop you again in about 15 minutes time or so to summarize some more, to translate some more. Thank you.
Sounds good. Okay. So what I was saying was that I always like to kind of preface before I go into the challenges we've experienced. Firstly, that this has been transformative for a lot of people, and secondly, just the scope of reform that we are talking about. So as of 2021, this is now the largest, most complex disability scheme in the world that uses this type of policy. We are servicing 500,000 people, which compared to England can sound small, for example, but it's not when you take into account geography in Australia, which plays a big part in any service delivery here, but particularly when you're talking about creating markets. So the NJS relies on having really robust, diverse markets of services, not just, you know, in the middle of Sydney, but in places that you might only be able to fly to or that it takes 5 days to drive to. So remoteness is a huge part of the kind of Australian experience and governing challenge as well. So in essence, we took an idea from England, we played around with it and made it a bit more complex, and then we thought they would implement it on a landmass 59 times the size of England, or roughly 347 times the landmass of Israel. So this was never going to be easy. The one thing that I think nobody really understood at the start, and I was lucky enough to be there at the start, was just how big the scope of change was. So I began researching the NJS in 2016. At that time, there was a team of 10 people working in our federal government on it, and they told me that they would only get smaller. And the reason that they would only get smaller was that the market would take care of itself. So people would advocate for their own needs, the market would offer and cater to their needs, and there would be very little for government to do. And this is genuinely how people thought early on. Fast forward to now, the Commonwealth government components are not even including any of those other boxes on that slide at all, has grown to occupy 2 full floors of an extremely large government building. So government never got to step out and deregulate the market, essentially. The other thing worth drawing attention to is that this had bipartisan support. There is very few policies, I struggle to think of one at all, of this scale that have been supported by both our left and right-wing political parties. Part of the reason that the NJS was supported by both is that personalisation has 2 drivers, one that appeals to the left and one that appeals to the right. So for the left, personalisation of the NJS was appealing because it was about human rights. It was about bringing Australia in line with the International Convention on Human Rights, respecting the autonomy and dignity of people with disability to self-determine their lives, their goals, and choose the supports that they wanted in their life to do that. For our right-wing political party, who has held government now for nearly 10 years, bit less than that, 8 years, it was a way of achieving efficiency. So they believed that, you know, by using these markets, they could have a small government, they could outsource everything, and markets would drive down prices through competition. In practice, what has actually meant, like, you know, to get the scheme up, that was really important to have this appeal to both the left and the right. But as we move through, you know, creating it and it is now live and fully implemented, it means that there's always been this kind of tug of war, because you can't really reconcile those 2 things. Markets have winners and losers. Human rights is about equity. So we have this tension that is played out right through the NDIS about what is this about? Is this about efficiency and markets and driving down cost, or is this about human rights? And different parts of that, you know, come to the fore and shift around at different points in time and in different areas of the scheme. So what I'm going to do next is...
Can I just stop before you go to the next? Sounds like a good point. Thanks, sorry about that. אוקיי, אז בעצם מה שג'מה דיברה עכשיו זה על הרעיון, 2 נקודות משמעותיות. אחד זה על הרעיון הזה של השוק החופשי שעומד בבסיס של הפרסונליזציה, של התקצוב האישי, ובעצם באידיליה, הרעיון הוא שיש שוק ואנשים יבחרו מתוך השוק הזה, והממשלה בעצם לא תצטרך להתערב, והשוק, כמו ברעיונות של שוק חופשי, ינהל את עצמו. זה מאוד 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 מורכב בכלל, ובתוך ההקשר האוסטרלי בפרט, מכיוון שזה מדובר על אזור גיאוגרפי מאוד מאוד רחב, מקומות שכדי להגיע אליהם גם צריך להגיע ב5 שעות טיסה, ובשביל שמדיניות של שוק תעבוד ותגביר את היכולת של בחירה ואוטונומיה וכו' וכו', צריך לא רק לדאוג שמישהו יספק שירותים במקומות המרוחקים האלה, אלא שיהיה מגוון של ספקי שירותים שיגיעו למקומות האלה. וזה יצריך הרבה מאוד התערבות מהממשלה, ובניגוד לפנטזיה המקורית שהממשלה תצטרך לעשות מעט מאוד, הממשלה עדיין צריכה להתערב ולתקן ולעבוד על השוק. אז זאת הייתה נקודה אחת. הנקודה השנייה, ואני חושבת שהיא גם קצת התייחסה לשאלה שנשאלה על המסגרת של התמיכה הפוליטית משתי המפלגות, הייתה פה שאלה בצ'אט, התוכנית זכתה לתמיכה משתי המפלגות, מפלגת השמאל ומפלגת הימין בשלטון, בגלל שבעצם יש בתוך התוכנית שתי אג'נדות שונות לגמרי ולפעמים מתחרות אחת בשנייה. האג'נדה הראשונה זה האג'נדה של זכויות אדם, כן, פרסונליזציה כאיזשהו כלי שמגביר את הבחירה, את האוטונומיה, את החופש של אנשים לעשות מה שהם רוצים ולקחת תפקיד יותר משמעותי בניהול החיים שלהם, שזאת וזכויות אדם והקשר של זה לאמנה של האו"ם, שזאת אג'נדה שמאוד התחברה למפלגות השמאל, יחד עם אג'נדה של הגברה של פעילות השוק, שאמורה גם להוריד עלויות ולייצר איזושהי יעילות בשירותים ויחס value for money יותר טוב. וזאת האג'נדה של הימין, והאג'נדות האלה נמצאות במתח אחת עם השנייה. So, thank you, G'ma.
Yeah, that was a good time to stop. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to walk you through the scheme. Firstly, how it should work and how it was designed, so that the best experience. And then I'm going to walk you through a bad experience. And you know, obviously there's a lot of different experiences, but just to give you a sense of how good it could be and how wrong it can go. And I might pause perhaps after the good one to let you translate, and then I'll go to the bad one. Okay, so if you were someone with a disability and you wanted to access the NDIS, firstly, you would apply through the agency, the NDIA, so that green box in the middle. And to do that, you would have to provide evidence from your healthcare providers, allied health, you know, all sorts of places to show that you meet the criteria that you have a severe and lifelong disability. If you are granted access to the scheme, you would then go on to a planning meeting. That would again be with that same agency, the green box. And in this meeting, you and people that you choose to bring with you would discuss what your goals are. They could be short-term goals, they could be long-term goals, and what the supports you need to meet those goals. And obviously, you know, people's goals can vary greatly. So for some people, their goals are about joining the workforce and the labour market for the first time in their lives. A lot of participants on the NDIS are kids, and it's about getting extra supports in school to support learning and that type of thing. And some people are, you know, up the other extreme end, and it was about getting out of state-run disability group homes into better supported living arrangements. So based on that meeting that you have, you would, with your planner in that agency, you would draw up a plan about how you were what services you were going to use to meet your goals. And it would get budgeted out and it would get approved. Maybe a few things would get modified. And you'd then be given money to go and buy services from disability service markets. Those markets would be in place, and you would offer, you could pick from a wide range of different services. There would be enough of them, you wouldn't have to wait, and you would get kind of what you wanted and needed. If you happen to run into trouble, you could contact a local area coordinator. So that is the yellow box I describe local area coordinators. They are a uniquely Australian thing. The UK has taken over the idea a bit as over there, but they are sort of Australian phenomena. I describe them as the glue in the system at the local level. So what they are is quite a few thousand individuals who are meant to be connecting people with disability with services, helping services better tailor their offerings to people and meet needs, and doing a kind of community connecting job down at the local level. So within the kind of, thousands of different communities that exist in Australia, they would be helping the scheme work at that level. If something were to go very badly wrong, there was abuse by your provider or someone used restrictive practices, you could report it to the Quality and Safeguarding Commission, which is the orangey red box in the top left-hand corner. And they would take action and they might kind of penalise providers, or they could shut providers down permanently. So that is how things would work at its best. And for some people, it does work that way. Would you like me to pause so you can describe that before I say how it goes at its worst?
אז בעיקרון איך שהתוכנית אמורה לעבוד וכשהיא עובדת טוב, אז בעצם השלב הראשון זה לפנות לתוכנית, להוכיח שיש לי זכאות לקבל ממנה שירותים, זאת אומרת שאני אישה עם lifelong disability, עם מצב שהוא לאורך החיים ואני עומדת בתנאים. ברגע שאכן אכן אני עומדת בתנאים, אני מקבלת איזושהי פגישה שהיא פגישת תכנון שעדיין ניתנת בעצם על ידי ה-National Disability Insurance Agency, על ידי הסוכנות המרכזית הזאת, ובתוך הפגישת תכנון הזאת עוברים על המטרות לטווח קצר, לטווח ארוך, כשזה משתמשים שהם ילדים למשל, אז לרוב המטרות שלהם זה תמיכה בלימודים, בבית הספר, כשזה משתמשים שהם מבוגרים, הרבה פעמים זה מטרות שקשורות לדיור עצמאי ומעבר לדיור בקהילה. מתוך התכנון הזה בעצם המשתמשים אמורים לצאת לתוך השוק, שאמור להיות שוק מגוון ועשיר, הם מקבלים את התקציב, כן, לפי התוכנית, מה המטרות שלהם, מקבלים את התקציב שאמור לענות על הדברים האלה, והם אמורים מתוך השוק לרכוש את הדברים האלה. אם זה לא עובד, אני נתקלת בבעיות בתוך השוק לרכוש את הדברים, יש פונקציה שנקראת Local Area Coordinators, המתאמים של האזור המקומי, שאמורים בעצם לתאם בין קהילות, גם קהילות שמגוונות מבחינת התרבות שלהם, הצרכים שלהם, וגם מבחינת האזורים הגיאוגרפיים, לעזור לאנשים להגיע לשירותים המקומיים, ליצור את הקשרים האלה בתוך הבלגן. אם חס וחלילה יש מקרים של התעללות, של הזנחה, אפשר להגיש תלונה לרשות מרכזית, שזה ה-Quality and Safeguarding Commission, המועצה להגנה בעצם, ושחוקרת מקרים כאלה של התעללות. Thank you.
Okay. So that's how it should work, and that's how it was designed. What I'm going to describe now is how a lot of people experience the scheme. So they would go to the NDIA, the green box again, and they would apply, and they'd have all of their evidence. And it's worth me saying that collecting that evidence can cost thousands of dollars to get all of your medical letters and everything in order, and you'll never be reimbursed for that either. So that can be very hard for some people to even get the evidence to get access. Often people will have an experience because of the nature of their disability or what's going on in their life where they kind of stop and start their application. So for example, it happens a lot with people that I've worked with traumatic brain injury, where, it's a very complex bureaucratic process. And so they stop and then they go back. And every time you go back, you have to start from scratch. So the agency doesn't hold anything where you got to, you have to begin again. You can also get rejected, even if you do meet the criteria. And then you need to go and collect more evidence and start again and try and get access again. And that does happen quite a bit. So if you make it over that hurdle, you then will meet with someone from the NJA to do your planning, so the green box. But you could also meet with a third-party contractor who could be over the telephone, which has caused a lot of problems for people who can't, they've called deaf people, for example, without interpreters. You might get given a local area coordinator to do your planning, because although that local area coordinator role is so important for making the scheme run, our government kind of repositioned them as into a planning role because they hadn't put enough staff into the NDIA, the agency that's the green box. If your plan is done by a local area coordinator or a third-party contractor, it then disappears into a black box to somebody at the agency who you will never meet in person, and you will never speak to that person about your goals. And a budget will come out, and some of the things you wanted are there, and some of the things you didn't ask for are there that you don't actually need, and some of the things that you really needed aren't there at all. So you can try and appeal that, but if you want to appeal it, you are filing a complaint to the same agency that gave you that plan. So most appeals are not successful in getting plans changed significantly. And then you go, okay, I'll take my budget. I'll do the best I can with this. And you go to these disability service markets, and you try and buy the services that you need. Well, first you have to find out who the providers are. And your local area coordinator doesn't know, because they've been planning and doing planning roles, and they haven't spent time in the community connecting and figuring out the services that are there and doing that role that was so important at that level. Or if you do find a service, there's a 6-month waiting list. So plans are reviewed every 12 months. So you get to your next plan review after 12 months, and you haven't been able to spend a lot of your plan because you either couldn't find a service, or the services that you found, you had to wait for 6 months and you only just got them. You asked your local area coordinator, but they couldn't help you either. So at that plan review, the NDA then says, well, you didn't spend all of the money we gave you, so you mustn't need it. And then they cut your budget. So you have half the money from the first one. If you have a problem with a service, again, you would contact the Quality and Safeguarding Commission, but they receive thousands of complaints because the government never set them up with a large number of staff. It's a very small staff running a nationwide regulatory body. I think it's got 150 staff for the whole country. So you might wait a long time for your complaint to be actioned, and that's really dangerous if you happen to be with a provider that is doing something very unsafe. So did you want to translate that before I say any more?
Yeah, thanks. אז בעצם ג'מה אומרת, מה שקודם היא תיארה לנו היה מה קורה כשהמערכת עובדת. אבל בכל שלב של הדרך הזאת יכולים להיות בעיות, ויש אנשים שעבורם מתעוררות בעיות. בשלב הראשוני של הגשת בקשה, בשביל לאסוף את כל המסמכים שצריך כדי להראות שאני עומדת בתנאים של התוכנית, זה תהליך שהוא מורכב, והוא גם יכול להיות מאוד יקר, ולעלות כמה אלפי דולרים להשיג את כל האבחונים האלה. לפעמים אנשים בגלל המצב שלהם מתחילים ומפסיקים, כן, מבחינת האנרגיות וכו', אז פה יכול להיות לי תהליך מורכב. אחרי שכבר התקבלתי, השלב של התכנון אמור להיות משהו שנעשה בצורה מרכזית על ידי הסוכנות, אבל גם פה אין מספיק אנשים שעושים את זה בצורה מרכזית, אז גם פה יש שירות שהוא שירות מופרט, ואפשר להגיע גם לאנשים המופרטים, לא תמיד בצורה הכי טובה. אחרי שמקבלים את התקציב, לא תמיד הוא בדיוק מתאים לצרכים, מתאים, לא משנה, מתחילים לרוץ איתו. יש עניין של למצוא את השירותים המתאימים, וצריך לקבל בזה עזרה ששוב, המתאמים האזוריים לא תמיד יודעים לעשות את התפקיד שלהם הכי טוב. צריך למצוא שיהיה שירות, וגם אם יש שירות, הרבה פעמים יש שם זמני המתנה ארוכים עד 6 חודשים. ואז מה שקורה זה שיש ריוויו של התוכנית, יש בחינה מחדש של התקציב, ואם רואים שלא השתמשת בהרבה מהכסף שהוקצב לך, בגלל שלא מצאתם את השירות המתאים, בגלל שהיה זמני המתנה וכו', אז מקצצים בתקציב. גם בסוכנות של ה-safeguarding, של ההגנה מהתעללות, יש תורים והמתנות, יש שם 150 עובדים על, אמרנו, 450,000 עד 600,000 אנשים שמשתתפים בתוכנית, וזה מצבים שיכולים ליצור סיכון, וצריך לחכות הרבה זמן עד שהתלונה שנבדקת. Thank you, G'ma.
Okay, so over time, we hear more and more stories of people experiencing things like the second experience and less like the first experience. So how did something so visionary shift away from its aims into that second experience, which is, you know, potentially worse than for some people than what they had before? I think different people would give you different answers to how we've drifted away from that. And I think it depends which part of the system you're focusing on, which kind of speaks a lot in and of itself. You know, we've created a system that is so complex, it's very hard for any one person to have complete and up-to-date knowledge of the scheme at any point in time. So I'm a public policy researcher. I tend to hang around the top of the scheme on that side with different parts of government and less down with the people accessing the scheme. So I'll explain what I see from where I sit. And that is a lot of structural decisions that have changed things, and a lot of political decisions as well. So what I thought I would do was actually talk about, you know, what are the very broad things you can learn from this, because I don't think that any country, Scotland thought about it, but they've backed off. I don't think that any country is looking to recreate the Australian NDIS in all of its now, you know, strange intricacies that have emerged. But there are some broad lessons for, you know, doing individualized disability funding policy that we can take from it. So I think the first lesson, what I might do is pause after each lesson for you to translate. Would that be best?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. The first lesson that we can take away is that personalised schemes take a lot of people to implement and run. So Australia has been working and living under a small government agenda for coming on to a decade. So there has been a staffing cap on the number of people that are allowed to be employed in any one of the boxes on the left-hand side of the diagram that are government agencies and local area coordinators. And it means that we haven't had the resourcing where it needs to be for things to run properly. There has been consistent sort of pressure on the NDIA that they can't meet demands. The Quality and Safeguarding Commission, as I said, the red box in the corner, you know, that is nationwide, and it's beyond the NDIS, so it's for providers across disability in the whole country. It's staffed with just 150 people and 5 executives. That's all it is. We saw how this under-resourcing plays out and can be really damaging when COVID hit in 2020, and then in our COVID kind of Delta wave that we've been in recently in Australia. So in both of those points in time, the Quality and Safeguarding Commission and the NDIA weren't resourced enough to help people with a disability, didn't get PPE in there, didn't do anything around safety in COVID. And we saw COVID spread through NJS networks because you had people, one provider going to 20 homes. So if they were infected, they would spread it very easily to vulnerable people with underlying health conditions. And in each way, we saw outbreaks in group homes. And, you know, all of that was preventable because we knew it was coming. We had a heads up. We were one of the last countries to get it. But these agencies were just too under-resourced to respond to that kind of challenge. So that really brought it to the fore in a big way. Did you want to translate that before I go on?
האתגר, או הלקח, עכשיו מדברת על הלקחים, מה אפשר ללמוד. אז הלקח הראשון זה שהיה פשוט פחות מדי אנשים, פחות מדי עובדים, פחות מדי משאבים שמופנים לעבודה הממשלתית הזאת, כן, הפנטזיה שהממשלה לא צריכה להתערב, וראו את זה רואים את זה תמיד, אבל ראו את זה באופן בולט במיוחד בהקשר של הקורונה, כשמטפלים עוברים מבית לבית לבית ופוגשים הרבה מאוד אנשים, והם פשוט מדביקים אחד את השני בקורונה. Thank you.
The second one is invest in training. So a lot of the staff working at the NGAA and our local area coordinators had no background of working with people with disability, and no training was provided, and it wasn't thought that that was something important to do. That's made it very hard for people to negotiate, who have a disability, to negotiate a very large bureaucracy, and they get lost in the system. And we have had, you know, if I'm to take an extreme example that's quite embarrassing for that agency, you know, they sent letters to blind people about their plans, for example. So a complete lack of training in some instances. I'll let you translate that one.
הלקח השני זה הצורך בהכשרה מתאימה לעובדים, בייחוד ברמות הגבוהות. אז למשל המתאמים באזורים המקומיים, אין להם שום הכשרה בהקשר לעבודה עם אנשים עם מוגבלות. למשל הם שולחים מכתבים מודפסים לאנשים עיוורים, כדי להודיע להם על שינויים בתוכנית, ולא עושים הנגשות לזה. Thank you.
The next one is you can have great design, but look out for politics. So two things that I just mentioned have their roots in politics. A small government agenda, that's a political decision that was made, and also a political decision not to invest in people and training them and how to work actually with people with a disability. Politics also saw some really important roles in the scheme outsourced. So the local area coordinators were meant to be part of the NDAA. They were meant to be part of government. So they could kind of share information and, you know, have a good, consistent governance framework around them and their work. What we actually have in practice is dozens of organisations overseeing local area coordinators all over the country. So depending on where you live, you could have a good local area coordinator experience, or you could have a bad one because they're employed by private contractors. I'll let you do that one.
הלקח השלישי זה שיש לחצים פוליטיים, זאת אומרת יש את התכנון שיכול להיות מעולה, אבל בסוף ביישום יש לחצים פוליטיים לכאן ולשם, גם מה שדיברנו עליו קודם, המחסור בעובדים, המחסור בהכשרה של העובדים, קשור ללחצים הפוליטיים לצמצם את ההוצאות של הממשלה ושל המגזר הציבורי, וגם ברמה של האנשים עצמם והקשר של המתאמים המקומיים, יכול להיות להם, הם מועסקים על ידי חברות ויכולים להיות להם אינטרסים שונים בתוך העסקה הזאת.
The next lesson is that markets don't look after themselves. So there was the presumption very early on, as I said, when it was 10 people, that it would only get, government involvement would only get smaller. They talked about deregulated markets within 3 years. We're 8 years in and there is no deregulated market. and we continue to have a lot of discussion and debates about market stewardship and whose responsibility it is. At this point in time, nobody has taken responsibility for market stewardship. So whose job is it to make sure there is a market there to purchase services from? No one's taking responsibility for that. And we don't have any kind of concrete answers to what a government would do if they were to steward these markets effectively.
Go on, sorry.
No, that's the end of that. I'll let you translate.
Matt, before you continue, we just need to pay attention to our time. So you run it. So it's up to you.
Yeah, I think that these lessons are quite important. So I think we'll
sure.
go through them and then we'll move on to Liron. Is that okay, G'ma? We'll
that's fine. I'm
do
really
the list of lessons and okay. אז הלקח הרביעי זה ששווקים לא מייצרים את עצמם סתם ככה, ושיש תפקיד לממשלה בארגון השווקים, בלדאוג לזה שבעצם יהיה מספיק היצע מבחינת השוק כדי לייצר את הניהול העצמי, ידו הנעלמה של השוק הזה, הממשלה צריכה להתערב בה, וגם למתכננים עדיין לא לגמרי ברור איזה בדיוק פעולות הממשלה צריכה לנקוט כדי לייצר את השוק הזה, אבל כרגע רואים שבהרבה מקומות השוק לא באמת מייצר את עצמו. Okay, thank you, G'ma.
The next one is that advocacy really, really matters in personalization schemes. There's a lot of presumption that individuals can advocate for themselves in a market environment. There have been points where advocacy has been nearly completely defunded in Australia, and luckily it hasn't, because our ability to self-advocate is, of course, completely dependent on all sorts of things in our lives. There was one study that found that getting an advocate to be in the room with you when you were doing your planning changed a budget by as much as 100,000 Australian dollars. I did do the calculation on this one. That is 230,000 shekel difference from when you had an advocate to when you didn't have an advocate.
אז הלקח החמישי זה ייצוג זה דבר מאוד מאוד חשוב, שעם כל הכבוד לרעיון של סינגור עצמי, זה דבר מאוד מורכב לעשות בתוך הקשר של שוק חופשי ומצריך הרבה מאוד ידע, ואין תקציב לייצוג של מישהו שיכול לבוא איתך לפגישות האלה. נערך מחקר שמצא שכאשר נמצא מייצג עם האדם בפגישת התכנון, ההבדל הממוצע בתקציב השנתי זה 230,000 שקל, שכשיש לי מייצג, התקציב השנתי גדל ב-230,000 שקל, לעומת מצב שאני נמצאת בלי מייצג. Thank you.
And then an extension on that is that you have to keep advocating. So a lot of people thought that when the scheme was first legislated, that the hard work was done, the fight was won, everyone could relax a bit. We had this amazing scheme in place. But actually what is kept it, from going, we have gone off track from what it should have been, but what has kept kind of pushing it back and stopping it going completely off track has been advocacy. Advocacy organizations, researchers joining in with advocacy organizations, and just a constant kind of pressure to not lose the original goals and vision of this scheme.
אז בעצם עוד לקח מרכזי זה שצריך כל הזמן להמשיך ולהילחם על המשמעות של התוכנית ועל המטרות המקוריות שלה. זה לא מספיק לתכנן מערכת נהדרת, צריך לדאוג שהיא תמשיך על ידי מאבק של ארגונים ושל מייצגים, שהיא תמשיך לעבוד כמו שצריך, אחרת זה פשוט נשחק כל הזמן.
And I have one final lesson, I'll be really quick, which is about thinking about how you balance stability and change. So within the overall kind of reform that is the Njs, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of minor changes, tweaks, you know, playing with the scheme. Sometimes they've been about, you know, we didn't get it right and we're trying to make this better. Sometimes they've been because of political things. Sometimes they happen and no one's quite clear why they've happened. Even when you're doing it to try and make it better, it creates this really turbulent, uncertain environment for providers and for participants. And it's created a lot of confusion for people about how they access the scheme if they're a participant, and if they're a provider, you know, how they get, you know, how do they get paid? Where do they register? That like really basic elements of the scheme just keep changing. So it's thinking about, you know, we need to keep working to make things better, but if we change things all the time, we just create a very confusing mess for people.
אז הנקודה האחרונה זה הצורך לשמור על איזשהו איזון בין שינוי, כי אנחנו רוצים לחתור ולשנות את הדברים לטובה ולשפר אותם, לבין הצורך ביציבות, כי השינויים המתמידים מאוד מבלבלים גם את המשתמשים, גם את הספקים, למשל שינוי בדברים בסיסיים כמו איך נרשמים לתוכנית, איפה משיגים דברים, יוצרים בלבול בתוך המערכת, אז זה לא איזו שאלה פתורה, זה מתח שצריך להתייחס אליו בין הרצון לשנות ולשפר לבין הצורך ביציבות ובהירות.
Okay, I do have more, but I will leave it there because we're at time. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about the NDIS.
Thank you so much, Gemma, for this wonderful lecture with this really clear lessons that I think we should all listen to and learn from, and I think that they really connect with our previous talk about the lessons from the UK and some of the challenges that we see there, especially the role of disabled people's organizations in keeping up the pressure on the one hand on governments, and also in supporting the users and the risks of this hyper-individualized scheme to disempower the users when they're not organized together. So thank you very much for this. And there was quite a lot of discussion in the chat box that I hope we will have time for later. But now I would like to move to Liron David, who will be commenting in Hebrew, but I will present you in English. So Liron David is the Policy and International Relations Chief Officer at Enosh. And she's a lawyer and a social worker and holds a master's degree in human rights law. She develops Enosh Global in the advocacy for implementation of the CRPD principles. And she is also a member of international committees at the World Health Organization and involved in human rights work and recovery for people with mental health. And Liron will be speaking about the regulatory aspects of the privatized welfare market in Israel. בבקשה, לירון.
Dana, thank you, G'ma, for a great lecture. I wrote a lot of points. I will speak in Hebrew now, but I wanted to say to you. So, שלום לכולם, תודה ענת על ההצגה, תודה לרוני, דוקטור רוני אולר שהביא אותי לכאן, ולהצטרף לסדנה הזאת, ולג'מה כמובן על ההרצאה המרתקת, שבאמת התחברה להרבה נקודות שחשבתי להתייחס אליהן בכמה דקות הקרובות, בהקשר של תקציב אישי והיבטי רווחה ורגולציה של שירותים לאנשים עם מוגבלות, ובפרט בגלל הכובע שלי באנוש באמת לאנשים עם מוגבלות נפשית ועולם השיקום בקהילה. בכובע השני אני רוצה להתייחס להיבט רגולטורי חשוב שנמצא בישראל בצורה מאוד חזקה, אבל פחות מדובר בשיח על רגולציה של מערכות רווחה, והוא הנושא של מכרזים, מכרזי רכש חברתי, שאני מניחה שכל מי שנמצאים פה נתקלו ברמה כזו או אחרת בתוצאות של מכרזי רכש חברתי או מתעסקים איתם ביום יום, ויש פה ממשק מאוד מעניין עם הדברים של ג'מה. אז קודם כל לגבי בריאות הנפש ושיקום בקהילה, אין ספק שהנושא של תקצוב אישי מביא בשורה לאנשים עם מוגבלות בכלל ולאנשים עם מוגבלות נפשית בפרט, כפי שגם דובר במפגש הראשון לסדרה הזאת בדברים של פיטר ברדספורד על אוטונומיה ובחירה, וצריך להזכיר שבמקרה הישראלי מוגבלות נפשית קצת נמצאת במקום אחר משאר המוגבלויות בגלל הפרוצדורה של התהליכים במדינה שלנו, היא נמצאת ומוסדרת תחת משרד הבריאות, אנשים עם מוגבלות נפשית מקבלים שירותי שיקום בקהילה למשל ממשרד הבריאות ולא הרווחה, ולזה צריך לשים לב גם בחקיקת חוק שירותי הרווחה שהוגש שנמצא בדיונים. וכשאנחנו מדברים על תקצוב אישי והשוק החופשי, שג'מה התייחסה לזה באתגרים האחרונים שלה, אז צריך להבין שיש פה זכאות אישית אמנם, אבל התוכנית נבנית עבור האדם, והוא יכול לנהל את זה לבד או באמצעות גורם שלישי. ולגבי הגורם השלישי הזה ולגבי צריכת השירות, זה מעורר קשיים בכל מיני רמות, יחד עם ההבטחה הגדולה שבזה. למשל, איך מנהלים ומאסדרים את כוחות השוק. היא דיברה על בעצם פיקוח כזה של שוק סגור למחצה, וככל שרוכשים שירותים, ובהקשר הזה למשל שירותי שיקום והחלמה בבריאות הנפש, איך אנחנו מפקחים על המחיר, ואיך אנחנו רואים שרמת השירות היא ברמה גבוהה, ואיך זה איכותי, ומה עם שירותים חשובים אבל לא רווחיים. במאמר אחר היא באמת מפרטת את המודלים השונים ג'מה להסדרת השווקים האלה, הסגורים למחצה, איך אפשר לנהל את זה באופן יותר נכון. שווה להסתכל על זה בהקשר הישראלי, בין היתר כי תחום השיקום בקהילה, שהוא חוק מאוד מתקדם במודל שהוא מביא, בסדר סל של שירותים, הוא בעצם קצת כזה שמבוסס מלכתחילה על מיקור חוץ, הוא מעולם לא ניתן על ידי הממשלה באופן חקיקתי, אלא נוצר באמצעות מיקור חוץ, ובהסכמים של משרד הבריאות עם ספקי שירותים. אז אמנם אין לנו תקציב אישי בהקשר של שירותי השיקום, אבל כן יש לנו זכאות ובחירה של האדם, אחרי שהוא נמצא eligible, כן? אחרי שיש לו זכאות ממשרד הבריאות, הבחירה אמורה להיות שלא מאיזה ספק הוא הולך ולוקח את השירות. עכשיו אנחנו יודעים שיש עם זה מגוון רחב של בעיות וקשיים, אבל המודל כמודל הוא קצת מהדהד את מה שג'מה מדברת עליו. אז אנחנו רואים בהקשר הזה אי מיצוי מאוד גדול של הזכויות. זאת אומרת, גם של אנשים שלא מגיעים בכלל להכרה בוועדות סל שיקום, וראינו את זה בדוחות מבקר המדינה וגם בכתיבה, גם בנתונים של משרד הבריאות, אבל גם מי שכבר קיבל ואוצ'ר או קיבל אישור של זכאות לאיזשהו שירות שיקומי, מאוד מאוד קשה לממש את השירות הזה. זאת אומרת, אנחנו רואים את זה בנתונים, 50-80% מממשים, וגם זה אחרי תקופה מסוימת. זאת אומרת, יש עוד הרבה עבודה בהקשר של מיצוי הזכויות. ואנשים צריכים, וגם ג'מה דיברה על זה בסופו של דבר, תאום טיפול וסיוע פרואקטיבי כדי לממש את הזכאות, בעיניי, בין אם זה תקציב אישי ובין אם זה במנגנונים שקיימים גם היום. אז אנחנו בעצם מדברים על רגולציה של שירותי רווחה, כי גם תקציב אישי מחייבת רגולציה על התהליך של השירות עצמו, כן? כאילו האדם לוקח שירות שיקום למשל, או שירות אחר, כן? או כל שירות אחר, צריך להסדר את השירות עצמו. ולכן אני רוצה להאיר זרקור בהקשר של הרגולציה הזו וההסדרה, על הסיפור של מכרזי רכש חברתי, procurements לצורך התרגום פה. זה כלי שאני טוענת שהוא כלי רגולטורי. בשוק החופשי אנחנו אומרים יש לנו מערכת של ספקים שמתחרים על מחיר או על איכות, אבל אנחנו רוצים להבין איך התחרות הזאת, יש בתוכה גם אלמנטים שאין לנו עליהם שליטה ובקרה במציאות הנוכחית, ואני מציעה להסתכל עליהם ולראות את המתח שמכרזים במציאות הישראלית משקפים במפגש בין עולם השיקום, הטיפול והשירות החברתי, לבין איך שזה מוסדר בתוך ההליך המכרזי, שהוא הליך שנעשה קצת במחשכים. זאת אומרת, אין לנו עליו כמעט ביקורת ציבורית, כאילו אין עליו בכלל ביקורת ציבורית. במאמר שהתפרסם שלי בשנת 2020 בכתב העת מחקרי משפט, אני טוענת הם מהווים כלי רגולטורי, ויותר מזה הם מהווים חלק מהמימוש המודרני של זכויות חברתיות, מכרזים. וכשמסתכלים בפריזמה הזו על מכרזים, ההיעדר של ביקורת ציבורית על התהליך וההיעדר של זכות הטיעון שמעוגנת בישראל בעקרונות המשפט המנהלי נורא חסרה. כי לציבור הרחב אין שום הזדמנות להגיב למדיניות שנקבעת היום במכרזים, בטח לא אנשים עם מוגבלות, כן? אין להם שום יכולת להיות מעורבים היום בעיצוב של מכרזים, והם לא מהווים לא חלק מהתהליך המכרז, לא העיצוב הראשוני שלו, לא במהלך ההליך התחרותי שלו, וגם לא ביישום והטמעת השירות אחרי שיש מישהו שזוכה במכרז. זאת אומרת, גם במהלך אספקת השירות, אין כמעט נקודות היוועצות עם מקבלי השירות על האיכות שלו. אז אני חושבת שכל התהליך הזה של מכרזים מאוד רחוק ממימוש האמנה שישראל חתומה עליה, אמנת ה-CRPD, וצריך להנגיש את התהליך הזה לציבור הרחב, אבל גם לאנשים עם מוגבלות. אני רוצה להעיר עוד נקודה שנוגעת לתכליות הכלכליות עסקיות במכרז. בסופו של דבר זה בעיקר מדידת עלויות, אבל אני רוצה להציע להסתכל על תכליות המכרזים לא רק במינוחים של יעילות ושוק חופשי ויעילות כלכלית ושוויון, אלא להבין שיש למכרזים תכליות נוספות רחבות יותר, ולכן צריך לבחון אותם באופן קצת אחר. מכרז לרכש חברתי הוא לא כמו מכרז לטובין אחרים, לכיסאות או לשולחנות או למחשבים או לתשתיות. יש שם תהליכים אנושיים ואישיים שצריכים לקבל מענה בתהליך של העיצוב שלו. אז אני מציעה כמה נקודות מבט גם במאמר, ופה אני אביא רק את הדבר המרכזי שנראה לי רלוונטי לסדרה שלנו. אני חושבת שצריך לייצר מצב שבו יש שיתוף ציבור בתהליכי המכרוז, גם בתוך עיצוב המכרז, גם לפתוח קצת את ההליך המאוד נוקשה הזה, שהוא סגור מאוד, שנקרא מכרז לרכש חברתי, ולאפשר נקודות מעורבות בתוך התהליך, וכמובן גם אחר כך בתהליכי הבקרה, לשתף אנשים עם מוגבלות בתוך הדבר הזה. אז אני חושבת שזה רלוונטי מאוד לשיח שלנו, כי כשהולכים על תקצוב אישי, אז זה צעד מעניין בדרך להטמעת הבחירה, אבל חייבים לעשות את ההסדרה של השוק, או את השוק הסגור למחצה שג'מה מדברת עליו, ואם אנחנו רוצים לייצר טרנספורמציה משמעותית, אז צריך להבין שהעולם הנאו-ליברלי הזה והשוק החופשי כנראה יישאר, אז בואו נראה איך אנחנו מנווטים בו בהכי הרבה נגישות, בהכי הרבה יכולת להשפיע על החיים שלנו ושל אנשים עם מוגבלות. אז תודה רבה.
Thank you so much, Liron, and it was really complimentary, I think. So G'ma talked about the personal budget side of things, and you talked about the provider side of things, and how really the government needs to do this sort of market stewardship through public involvement in the procurement. And I would like to now open the floor for some questions and answers that we have. So I've been collecting a few questions. So first of all, there were questions about the eligibility, who is eligible for the service, and also as the new scheme was implemented, what were the criteria for this implementation stage? So who was given priority to start with the pilot program, or to start earlier, and what was rolled out later? So that was one question. Another question was about the review process of the personal budgets. Are the budgets changing from year to year, how they are reviewed? And I would like to add to that, in light of Liron's talk, how are the providers reviewed, and are they reviewed through the program? How do you become a registered provider? So let's start with that, and then we have a few more questions as well. But
that's a lot in and of itself. So at the very start, there were 7 pilot sites, and each one prioritized different disabilities or different age groups. So it was quite different all over the country. And then once we moved from the pilot sites to the whole implementation, it changed to anybody who is eligible. And being eligible means meeting that criteria of severe and lifelong disability. There is a list of disabilities that gives you automatic access to the scheme. That list changes a little bit. And I'd say where the kind of rub is about whether you get access or don't get access is whether something is viewed as a health condition, not a disability. But of course, that's not a distinction that you can really make, because most people with disability experience underlying health issues, and then health issues can create functional disabilities, for example. Did you need to translate that before I answer the other questions, or do you want me to just keep going?
I think we have very short time, so okay. I'll let you go on.
The budgets are changing year to year, and they're actually changing a lot and changing in one direction. So what we have seen is decreases in budgets over time, because our current government is it's a conservative government. It doesn't like spending money on large welfare programs, and reducing budgets is one way of making the scheme cost less. Nobody's budget is growing in the scheme. So that's one of the things that advocates are fighting at the moment, and researchers as well, who, like myself, saying, this isn't how we should be doing it. The provider question is a really, really interesting one. So you do have to register with the Quality and Safeguarding Commission, which was the red box on the diagram, to be a provider. But you don't get reviewed per se. So that is left to the market. The idea is that if you're a bad provider, not so bad that you get a complaint up to a regulatory body, but you're a poor provider, you just people won't use you and you'll go out of business. So that is sort of how it's set up to take care of that. But what's emerged, I think, is really interesting. So when government doesn't step in to address some problems like that, you get civil society popping up with its own solutions, right? And what's happened with the NDIS is there's a site called Clickability, and it's pretty much like Yelp for disability services. So people go on there, and if they use a service and they find that it's bad, they rate it on an online system that is being run on a voluntary basis, basically, by an organization. So.
Thank you, G'ma. Liron, do you want to comment on the question of providers? So a lot of it was about Australia. I assume you don't want to comment on that.
ניתן לעוד שאלות לזרום ואז.
Yes. I would say that we are joined here today by Ifat Klein, who works at the Joint, our partners in the Center for Disability Studies. And the Joint Israel are running a local pilot in Israel for personal budgets. And it would be great, Ifat, if you can tell us a little bit about your project here. And also Mandy was asking a bit about your pilot here, and whether the pilot includes people with complex disability or only people who are considered to be highly functioning. So Ifat, we would love to hear from you in Hebrew about the pilot in Israel.
אוקיי, אז קודם כל אני מתנצלת שאני בלי מצלמה. אני אגיד רק ממש בכמה מילים, ואני רואה שנמצאים פה גם חלק גדול מהשותפים שלנו, נילי דניאל כאן ממשרד הרווחה, וראיתי שמרק היה קודם, ואולי יש עוד כמה אנשים שאני מפספסת. אז באמת יש פיילוט שהוא כרגע מצומצם, שעובד גם עבור אוכלוסייה של משרד הבריאות של סל שיקום, גם עבור אוכלוסייה של מנהל מוגבלויות במשרד הרווחה. הוא עובד כבר בשנים האחרונות, שנים מספר מצומצם, ובשנה האחרונה הוא מתבסס קצת יותר, ומתחיל לעבוד לפי מודל. בבנייה של המודל אנחנו באמת מתמודדים עם הרבה מהשאלות שג'מה, מהאתגרים שג'מה תיארה, גם בהקשר של לוודא שבאמת השירותים ניתנים עם הליווי הנכון, שיש מספיק מתאמי טיפול שעובדים בצורה מספיק אינטנסיבית עם האנשים, שיש מספיק מדריכים אישיים, כל הסוגיה של האחריות על האיכות של השירותים ועל עצם הקיום של השירותים והמגוון שלהם, יש פה משהו שצריך לאזן אותו בין השוק החופשי הזה והרצון לתת לאדם לבחור את כל השירותים שהוא רוצה מאיפה שהוא רוצה, ומצד שני כן להשאיר איזשהו פיקוח ולוודא שיש מספיק, וגם סוגיות נוספות שעלו כאן, זה דברים שאנחנו מתמודדים איתם. נכון שהפיילוט עדיין, לשאלה שעלתה, נכון שהפיילוט עדיין לא נותן מענה לכל האוכלוסיות, עדיין לא נבחן עבור כל האוכלוסיות של שני המשרדים האלה, אבל כמו ששמענו על המורכבות, אנחנו חושבים שנכון יותר להתחיל עם אוכלוסייה שבה אנחנו יכולים באמת לעקוב מקרוב ולקחת אחריות ולהרחיב בהדרגה. הפיילוט הזה כמובן מלווה במחקר, שמתייחס גם לאתגרים האלה וגם לדברים נוספים שעוד יעלו. ואנחנו, אני חושבת יחד עם כולם, מאוד סקרנים לראות לאן זה יגיע, מה נגלה ועד כמה נצליח באמת, או מתי נצליח להרחיב אותו הלאה לאוכלוסיות נוספות. אנחנו רק נציין שאנחנו באמת מלווים גם במחקר, גם בתמיכה מאוד מאוד משמעותית של קרן אריסון, ועבודה מאוד אינטנסיבית ומשותפת של משרדי הרווחה, הבריאות ואנחנו בג'וינט.
Thank you very much, Ifat. So a couple more questions that we had. One was just people were wondering if you could tell us the list of diagnostic labels that automatically qualify people for the services. So that's quite a simple one. And the more difficult question is about, you raised the issue of the state's responsibility for developing new services, either not just replacing the services that run under block funding, but also developing new services that can support community life. So if you can tell us a little bit more about that, what the government is actually doing, what you think it should be doing, that would be wonderful.
With the list of eligible disabilities, it's actually very long and technical. I can do a quick Google and try and find it for you, but I certainly can't recite it, and there's quite a few hundred on there as well. And I don't have a medical background, and a lot of them I haven't heard of before. Sorry, what was the second question? It was about what the state governments are doing or should be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So about developing services, new services.
Yeah, look, it's been very interesting in that there's been a kind of tug of war going on between state governments, federal governments, and the NDIA about who and how should services, how do you grow those markets and whose job is it? Nobody has actually done a lot from a government perspective. So one of the research projects that I have going at the moment is that we've been talking to every kind of actor involved in the NJS who isn't government. So advocacy, the people who run the clickability site, the Yelp site that I talked about, providers, and all sorts of kind of funny little things that have popped up to try and fill this gap. And what we're trying to capture in that is what are all the things that actually everybody's already doing at a local level to help this function, because government hasn't stepped into that space. And the idea behind that is that if we think about, when we think about markets in the NJS, what we do is you have a category, to get very technical, but you have a primary disability, and that's your category, and then you have every different service that you would access. So when you look at your list of primary disabilities and then lists of types of services, you have 9,000 markets that you were looking at, and that doesn't account for geography. That's just when you're matching a disability with a service. So 9,000 plus giant geography. So I argue, people I work with agree, that no government can oversee something like that. You can't steer something like that from the top. And I think that, you know, we've learned that kind of worldwide around top-down only approaches don't work. But in the market stewardship literature internationally, as well as in Australia, and sometimes it's called market shaping in the UK, it's always positioned as government's responsibility to do that. What we're trying to say is that actually the role of governments is probably to support a lot of local actors who are already doing things that they're doing. So some are providing free information on what services are out there, some are rating the services, providers are helping their clients connect to other providers, they're helping them with all sorts of things they're not actually paid to help them with. And what we think is the government needs to get in there and support that rather than replicate that.
G'ma, we should also mention that the government put a cap on prices currently. So the price mechanism is also a big part of the story. Yes.
So prices are capped in the NDIS. So that shapes really who is able to operate in it. So we've seen the closure of some pretty major and important organizations. The prices in a lot of areas are not set high enough to be financially viable and operate in the scheme. And it's interesting because a lot of the political debates in Australia are playing out about this scheme is costing too much money, and yet the prices are set so low that you know, people can't keep operating. Also, it's the opposite of what you know, when I talked about the two drivers, when you go to the pure market economics driver of it, it was about driving down prices through competition. But in fact, we're not seeing that because the price cap, like the prices were set well below. No one can compete on price. I don't think the price caps, as I said, there was talk right early on in the scheme about it moving to a deregulated market. People don't even talk about that anymore. I think it's so far off. So it is, you know, it is very much a quasi market in that government is the price setter, as well as the you know, purchaser through individuals.
Thank you very much. Ruti Cohen, you had a question? Ruti?
I'm not sure if she's still here. I don't see her name up in the list.
This will be the last one because we are out of time.
Yeah, we are out of time. So there was another, I think that's quite a quick one if Ruti is not with us. Oded was asking, can you use the personal budget to purchase services not through a registered provider?
That is a really good question. Some people can and some people can't. It depends how you access the scheme. And it gets very, very technical, which I can explain, but it'll take a long time. So I'll give you the quickest answer possible, which is that you can either completely manage your own budget and plan, which I gather is about 1 to 2 days a week of administrative work to do that. And if you do that, you can use providers who aren't registered, but if you choose to do it any other way in the scheme, then you can only use registered providers.
So really, thank you so much, G'ma, for this clear and thorough overview of the complex scheme and the challenges that you're facing. And I think it was really, really...
Can I say something, one last comment, because people ask in chat and privately, what are the outcomes? So in the bottom line, what are the outcomes of the NDIS, and whether, despite all the challenges that you described, the outcomes exceeds the drawbacks. You know what I mean?
We don't know.
Benefits, sorry.
Yeah, we don't know. You're all honing in on all of the problems of this scheme and our government at the moment. No evaluation is being done. So there's no data that's being released to anyone to see what people's outcomes are. And we only ever get that when a politician wants to make an argument about something. It is quite mind-blowing that you would launch a $22 billion scheme, second biggest scheme in the country, and you wouldn't be looking at whether or not it's doing the job that it's meant to do. So that's been another thing. I probably should have said right at the start that the scheme was designed under our left-wing government, and then they lost power and it went to our right-wing government to implement. So there's a lot of things like evaluating outcomes that should have always been there, but just kind of got scrapped under this government that kind of got itself signed up to something that it hasn't really wanted to implement. And certainly not in the way that it got passed in legislation, which is why we see these sort of stealth attacks on it by putting caps on staff, by government not really controlling or managing or doing its job in markets. The regulator says it has no job in markets, for instance, which is strange to me. Australia's coming up to a federal election, and if the government was to change, I think that we would start to see a very different NDIS, which speaks to how much politics can influence something like this.
Okay, so thank you very, very much, G'ma, Liron, Ronnie, Shirley, Nili, Oz for the technical support, Ohad for the transcription, all of you for the participation and the really lively discussion on chat. And Oz, I don't know if we can save the chat as well, because that would be probably quite useful to put that in the summary. We will send out a brief summary, so about a one-pager in Hebrew of a summary of what was said here today. And we do invite you all for our next lecture in the series, which will be in 3 weeks' time, same hour, same day. And we'll send out an invitation about that. Thank you again, Liron, G'ma, really insightful talks from both of you. And I'm sure they will have an impact, at least on our side of trying to implement the legislation. And as you said, G'ma, there is a big political fight around these issues now when the bill is being designed, but also in the future and as we go along. So thank you very much.
Everyone.